Officer pulls over nurse for speeding, shocked to see his own son in the passenger seat. During a routine morning patrol, an officer pulled over a speeding vehicle without emergency lights or sirens. What he expected to be a simple traffic violation turned into something far more alarming. Inside, he found a frantic nurse, desperately trying to rush an unconscious patient to the hospital. As the emergency blanket shifted, revealing a glimpse of dark, curly hair, time seemed to freeze. The dying child in the passenger seat wasn't just any patient, it was his own son, who should have been safe at school. In that moment, his world shattered, and the truth behind how his son ended up there would soon unleash a father's worst nightmare. Stay tuned until the end of this special story. You don't want to miss what happens next. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the Reed family home, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table. Malcolm Reed, already dressed in his crisp police uniform, stood by the counter, sipping his coffee while watching his 10-year-old son, Jason, pick at his breakfast. Jason's reluctance was clear. His fork idly pushed scrambled eggs around the plate with no real intent to eat. Martha Reed, Malcolm's wife, moved around the kitchen with the practiced ease of their morning routine. Her voice carried a note of concern as she noticed Jason's unusual quietness. "Jason, honey, you need to eat something. It's going to be a long day at school." Jason mumbled something under his breath, his eyes fixed on his plate. Malcolm glanced at his watch, realizing they were running late. He was about to urge Jason to hurry when he noticed his son's slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. Something was clearly wrong. "Jason," Malcolm said, softening his tone, "what's bothering you? Are you feeling sick?" Jason shook his head but still avoided his father's gaze. "I don't want to go to school," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Malcolm exchanged a concerned look with Martha before kneeling beside his son's chair. "Is it the bullies again? Are Elam and Edric still bothering you?" Jason nodded hesitantly, his eyes welling with tears. Malcolm felt a mix of anger and sadness well up inside him. He had hoped the school's anti-bullying efforts would have resolved this, but it was clear the problem persisted. "Let me see," Malcolm said gently, leaning closer to Jason. That's when he noticed his son's feet, partially hidden under the table. The boy's toenails were black and peeling, clear signs of recent trauma. "Jason, what happened to your feet?" Jason's lower lip trembled as he recounted the incident. "Elam and Edric. They made me run barefoot on the walkway a few days ago. They said kids with my skin color don't need shoes." Malcolm's stomach churned with anger at the racist taunts, but he forced himself to remain calm for Jason's sake. Taking a deep breath, he tried to steady his voice. "Jason," he said firmly, "you need to stand up for yourself. Remember those self-defense techniques I taught you? Use them if they try to hurt you again." Before Jason could respond, Martha intervened, her voice gentle but firm. "Malcolm, he's just a child." Malcolm held up a hand. "And that's why he needs to learn now, Martha. He can't always rely on us to protect him." Jason glanced nervously between his parents. "But Dad, what if I get in trouble for fighting back?" "You won't get in trouble for defending yourself, son," Malcolm said firmly. "It's important to show them you're not an easy target." Jason hesitated, then asked timidly, "Could I maybe have pepper spray or a mini taser?" Malcolm's expression hardened. "No, Jason. Those are dangerous, especially at school. You need to rely on your strength and those techniques I taught you." As Jason nodded reluctantly, Martha watched the exchange, worry etched on her face. She tried once more to coax her son to eat, but Malcolm had already ushered him towards the door. "Stop babying him, Martha," Malcolm said firmly. "If he's hungry, he can eat at school. We're running late." Jason climbed into the car, his small frame tense with unease. As they pulled out of the driveway, the sun glinted off the polished surface of Malcolm's police cruiser, a symbol of authority that now cast a shadow over the father and son as they drove towards what would be an unforgettable day. The sight of the school painted a picture of resignation rather than the confidence Malcolm had hoped to instill. For a moment, He debated getting out of the car and marching into the principal's office to demand action against the bullies. But then he remembered his own words about self-reliance and standing up for oneself. With a heavy sigh, Malcolm put the car into drive. He lingered in the parking lot a little longer, watching as Jason disappeared into the school building. The father in him wanted to rush in, to shield his child from the world's cruelties. Yet, the police officer in him argued this was a necessary lesson, an essential step in Jason's growth. Finally, with one last look at the school, Malcolm drove away, the gnawing feeling in his gut growing heavier with every passing mile. He tried convincing himself that he had made the right decision, that Jason needed to face these hard lessons. But as he headed toward the police station, a nagging doubt persisted, whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made a terrible mistake. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the town as Malcolm's patrol car disappeared around the corner. Left behind was a school where unseen dangers lurked, and a young boy prepared to face his fears alone. Malcolm's patrol car cruised slowly down Main Street, the mid-morning sun glinting off its polished surface. He had been on duty for hours now, but his mind remained preoccupied with thoughts of Jason and their tense morning exchange. The routine task of checking parking meters and issuing tickets offered little distraction from his inner turmoil. As he moved methodically along the street, Malcolm's trained eyes scanned the parked cars, looking for expired meters or parking violations. The mundane nature of the work felt jarringly at odds with the emotional weight he carried. Each ticket he wrote seemed like a stark contrast to the complex family drama that occupied his mind. Suddenly, a flash of white caught his attention. A Dodge Grand Caravan, marked with a red hospital cross, sped past him, clearly exceeding the speed limit. Malcolm's instincts as a police officer kicked in immediately, pushing his personal concerns to the background. Without hesitation, he slid into his patrol car, flipped on the siren, and began the pursuit. The chase didn't last long. Recognizing the flashing lights behind her, the Med-Ivan driver quickly pulled to the side of the road. Malcolm approached the vehicle cautiously, his hand instinctively resting near his holster. As he neared the driver's side window, he saw a nurse behind the wheel, her blue uniform unmistakable. Her face was a mix of panic and professionalism, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. "License and registration, please," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had perfected over years on the force. The nurse fumbled in her purse, producing the requested documents along with her hospital ID. Her name, Nancy Mulligan, was printed clearly on the badge. As Malcolm reviewed the papers, Nancy spoke, her voice urgent but steady. "Officer, I know I was speeding, but I have an emergency. There's an unconscious boy in the passenger seat. He needs immediate medical attention." Malcolm's gaze shifted to the passenger seat. A small figure lay wrapped in an emergency blanket, an oxygen mask covering much of his face. The sight sent a chill down Malcolm's spine, uncomfortably reminding him of his own son. Despite the clear urgency of the situation, Malcolm's training compelled him to ask, "Why aren't you using an ambulance? And why is the patient in the front seat?" Nancy's explanation came in a hurried stream of words. "All our ambulances are out on other calls. This is a hospital car, and I had to use it because of how critical his condition is. I secured him in the front so I could monitor him for internal bleeding and make sure he was restrained safely. If I had laid him in the back, he might have choked on blood or vomit, and sudden movements could worsen his injuries." Malcolm nodded as he processed her explanation. His eyes lingered on the unconscious child, an uneasy sense of familiarity tugging at him. The blanket shifted slightly, revealing dark, curly hair, a detail that hit uncomfortably close to home. Shaking off the thought, Malcolm handed back Nancy's documents. "All right, Miss Mulligan. I understand the urgency. Just be careful. Safety is still important, even in emergencies." "Thank you, officer," Nancy replied gratefully. "I promise to be more cautious." Malcolm stepped back as the Med-Ivan pulled away, its white frame quickly disappearing down the road. but the unease in his stomach remained, heavier now than before. Just as Malcolm resumed his patrol duties, his phone buzzed. The school's number flashed on the screen. A mix of anticipation and dread settled over him as he answered. Officer Reed speaking. Mr. Reed, this is Catherine, Jason's homeroom teacher, came a concerned voice. I'm calling because Jason hasn't been in class, not just today but for the past 3 days. We've been trying to reach you. The world seemed to tilt as Malcolm absorbed the news. What do you mean? I drove Jason to school this morning. I watched him walk in. There was a pause. I'm sorry, Mr. Reed, but Jason hasn't been in class. Are you sure he went inside? Panic set in as Malcolm replayed the morning's events in his head. He had seen Jason walk toward the entrance, but had he actually watched him go inside? I need to go, Malcolm stammered, ending the call abruptly. Heart pounding, he jumped into his patrol car and sped toward St. Louis Children's Hospital. The day had started with a father's misguided attempt to toughen up his son but had spiraled into a nightmare. Malcolm knew that whatever happened next, the weight of his morning's decisions would stay with him for the rest of his life. Malcolm's patrol car screeched to a halt in the hospital parking lot, the tires leaving dark marks on the asphalt. He burst out of the vehicle, his police uniform contrasting sharply with the panic etched across his face. The emergency entrance doors barely had time to slide open before he rushed through, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor as he made his way to the information desk. My son, he gasped, his breath short and labored. Jason Reed, he was brought in recently. Where is he? The nurse behind the desk, startled by Malcolm's sudden appearance, quickly typed on her computer. Yes, Jason Reed. He's currently in the ICU. I'll have someone take you there right away. As a young orderly appeared to guide him, Malcolm turned back to the nurse. Please, can you contact my wife? Her name is Martha Reed. He rattled off her phone number, his voice cracking with emotion. Of course, Officer Reed, the nurse replied, jotting down the number before picking up the phone. The journey to the ICU felt endless, each step weighing heavily on Malcolm's mind. As they rounded a corner, he spotted a familiar figure, Nurse Nancy, the woman he had stopped earlier for speeding. She was sitting in a corner, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Malcolm approached her cautiously. Nurse Mulligan? Nancy looked up, her eyes widening in a mix of recognition and fear. Officer Reed, I'm so sorry about the speeding. I didn't realize. Is there a problem? Am I in trouble? Malcolm raised a hand to silence her apologies. My son, Jason. Is he? Nancy's expression shifted from fear to sorrow. The boy. He's in there, she said, gesturing to a nearby room. The doctors are with him now. I'm so sorry, Officer Reed. If I had known, Malcolm nodded numbly, unable to find the words. He moved toward the room, his heart pounding. Through the window, he saw a small figure on the bed surrounded by medical equipment. It was Jason, his boy, so small and fragile amidst the tubes and wires. A doctor emerged from the room, his face serious. Mr. Reed, I'm Dr. Flores. Your son is in critical condition. We've had to induce a coma due to the severity of his internal injuries. The word struck Malcolm like physical blows. Internal injuries? What happened? Dr. Flores explained the situation. Jason had suffered severe internal bleeding, likely from a fall. As the doctor spoke, the events of the morning rushed back to Malcolm in a whirlwind of guilt and anger. The bullies, the school, his own harsh words. Nancy approached hesitantly. Officer Reed, I want you to know we did everything we could to get Jason here as quickly as possible. Every second counted. Malcolm turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anguish and gratitude. Thank you, he managed. I'm sorry I delayed you. Nancy shook her head. You were doing your job. I understand. As Malcolm stood there, torn between rushing to his son's bedside and demanding answers, he heard a commotion down the hall. Martha had arrived, her face a mask of fear and confusion. Malcolm, she cried, running toward him. What happened? Where's Jason? Malcolm embraced her, his composure finally cracking. Martha, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you this morning. I should have. Martha peered into Jason's room, her gasp of shock cutting through Malcolm's apologies. The full weight of the day's events pressed down on them as they stood together. Their son, their little boy, was fighting for his life, and nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, with the sterile hospital hallway as their backdrop and the beeping of machines as their soundtrack, Malcolm made a silent vow. He would find out exactly what had happened to Jason and ensure those responsible faced justice. More importantly, he promised himself that when Jason recovered, he would be a different father, one who listened more, pushed less, and protected fiercely while understanding deeply. With a quick word to Martha, who was still tirelessly calling everyone they knew, Malcolm left the hospital. His mind was set on uncovering the truth about what had happened to Jason. The drive to the school blurred by, familiar streets passing unnoticed as Malcolm's thoughts raced. Pulling into the parking lot, he stopped at the same spot where he dropped Jason off that morning. Had it really been just this morning? It felt like a lifetime ago. As Malcolm strode toward the main entrance, his police uniform seemed to part the crowds of students and teachers like a physical force. The hallways, once familiar and benign, now felt hostile and foreign. Without hesitation, he went directly to the principal's office, barely acknowledging the startled looks of the staff he passed. Knocking briskly on the door, he stepped inside, trying to maintain professionalism despite his simmering frustration. The man behind the desk glanced up, his face paling at the sight of the furious officer. "Officer Reed," the principal stammered. "We've been trying to reach you." Malcolm cut him off, his voice low and edged with anger. "I want to know exactly what happened to my son, and I want to know now." The principal swallowed hard, visibly unnerved by Malcolm's intensity. "We're still piecing together the details, but it seems there was an incident on the playground." "An incident?" Malcolm's voice rose, the words sharp. "My son is in a coma. That's not an incident, that's an assault. Where are Elam and Edric?" The principal's eyes widened at the mention of their names. "How did you?" "Jason told me this morning they'd been bullying him," Malcolm said coldly, his fists clenched. "We've had problems with them before, if you even remember. Now, where are they?" Shifting uncomfortably in his seat, the principal finally replied, "Their parents came and collected them earlier. They said the boys weren't feeling well." Malcolm's fist hit the desk with a resounding thud, making the principal flinch. "You let them go? Without even questioning them?" We didn't have any concrete evidence connecting them to the incident," the principal stammered. "There were no witnesses, and the area where Jason was found isn't covered by CCTV. He was discovered alone, bleeding, unconscious on the playground. He could have fallen. Malcolm's voice dripped with disbelief and fury. His mind raced, his police instincts overriding his emotional turmoil. "What about other cameras? You must have footage of them entering or leaving the area." The principal nodded hesitantly. "We've secured what footage we have. The police detectives are reviewing it. But we shouldn't make baseless accusations." "Baseless?" Malcolm interrupted, his voice a cold, dangerous whisper. "The doctor confirmed signs of aggression on Jason's body. And this morning, he refused to go to school, admitting he was being bullied. Let me make one thing very clear. If I find out this school has been covering for those boys because of who their parents are, there will be consequences. Do you understand me?" The principal nodded, his face ashen. "Officer Reed, I assure you, we want to uncover the truth as much as you do. We've implemented stricter anti-bullying measures." "Clearly, they're not working," Malcolm snapped. "My son is fighting for his life because of what happened here today, and it's not the first time he's been targeted." "It's not?" The principal seemed taken aback. I wasn't aware." "Not aware or didn't care?" Malcolm shot back, his anger flaring anew. "I've complained multiple times about Elam and Edric bullying Jason. They've been tormenting him for months, calling him names, stealing his lunch, cornering him. And now this. The principal seemed to shrink in his chair. I'm so sorry, Officer Reed. We'll cooperate fully with the investigation. You'd better, Malcolm said, his tone cold. Because if Jason doesn't make it, every decision this school has made, every blind eye turned, will come to light. He pulled the phone out quickly, his pulse quickening as Martha's name flashed on the screen. Without a second thought, he swiped to answer. Martha. Malcolm's voice came out strained, sensing something was wrong. Malcolm, we need to talk. Martha's voice trembled on the other end. It's about Jason. He's not doing well. Malcolm's gaze flickered back to the screen for a moment, where an image of Jason walking with Elam and Edric remained frozen in time. Shaking himself out of it, he turned his full attention to Martha. Is he okay? He asked, his voice heavy with worry. The doctor has an update on Jason's condition. The test results are in, Martha said, her voice cracking. You need to come back to the hospital. Right away. Malcolm felt his heart sink as panic surged in his chest. Glancing at Bradley and the detective, who were both watching him closely, he made up his mind. I'm on my way, he said, his voice resolute. Hanging up, he locked eyes with Bradley. I need to go, but keep me updated on the footage, Malcolm instructed firmly. Bradley gave a solemn nod. We'll keep working on it. Go be with your family. Without waiting for another word, Malcolm turned and left the room, his steps quick and heavy as he headed for the exit. The weight of the footage and what Jason had endured hung over him like a storm cloud, but none of it mattered more than getting to his son. Malcolm glanced at Martha, who sat quietly beside him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The bond between them felt stronger now, forged in the fire of their shared anguish and determination to fight for their son. The door to the operating room opened, and Dr. Flores stepped out, her face calm but visibly tired. Malcolm and Martha leaped to their feet, their hearts pounding in unison. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, Dr. Flores began, her voice steady. The surgery was a success. A wave of relief washed over them, and Martha's legs nearly gave out as she leaned against Malcolm for support. He's stable and recovering in the ICU, Dr. Flores continued. It'll take time, but I'm optimistic about his prognosis. Nurse Nancy is also doing well and is being monitored closely. Tears spilled freely from Martha's eyes as she whispered, Thank God. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Flores offered a small smile. He's a strong boy, and he has a remarkable support system. It's a team effort, and Nurse Nancy's selflessness played a crucial role in saving his life. Malcolm swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. When can we see him? Soon, Dr. Flores assured them. He needs some time to stabilize, but we'll let you know as soon as he's ready for visitors. As the doctor walked away, Malcolm pulled Martha into his arms, holding her tightly as they absorbed the enormity of the moment. For the first time in days, hope didn't feel like a distant dream. It was real, tangible, and within reach. Malcolm, Martha whispered, her voice trembling. We're going to get through this. Together. He nodded, his jaw set with determination. Yes, we will. And when Jason wakes up, he'll know he's not alone. Not anymore. As they sat back down, their hands still entwined, Malcolm allowed himself to breathe deeply for the first time in what felt like forever. There was still a long road ahead, confronting the school, seeking justice, and ensuring no other family suffered as theirs had. But at that moment, in the quiet sanctuary of the waiting room, they held on to one unshakable truth. Jason was alive. And with that, everything else seemed possible. The procedure was extensive, but she's stable. Her sacrifice has given Jason the best possible chance at recovery. As Dr. Flores excused herself to check on her other patients, Malcolm and Martha embraced, the tension of the past hours finally releasing in a flood of tears and whispered thanks. Jason's going to be okay, Martha murmured, her face buried in Malcolm's chest. Our boy is going to be okay, Malcolm echoed, holding his wife tightly. Even as relief began to settle in, Malcolm's mind was already racing ahead. Jason's recovery, the legal battle they would face, and the changes their family needed to make. But for now, in this fragile moment, all that mattered was Jason's survival and the second chance they'd been given. As they prepared to visit their son in the ICU, Malcolm silently renewed his vow to be the father Jason needed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they would face it together, stronger and more united than ever before. The soft beeping of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Malcolm and Martha kept their vigil at Jason's bedside. Ever since he'd been wheeled in and connected to the monitors, neither parent had left his side. They spent the night sleeping restlessly on a small couch in the corner, unwilling to be far from him even for a moment. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, Malcolm stirred, his body aching from the uncomfortable sleeping position. He glanced at Martha, who was already awake, her eyes fixed on Jason's still form. "Any change?" Malcolm asked softly, his voice rough with sleep. Martha shook her head. "Not yet, but the nurse who came earlier said his vitals are looking good." Malcolm nodded, stretching as he stood. "I'll grab us some coffee from the cafeteria. Do you want anything else?" Before Martha could respond, a small movement caught their attention. Jason's hand, which they had been holding throughout the night, twitched slightly. "Jason!" Martha called, her voice trembling with hope. "Honey, can you hear us?" Slowly, Jason's eyes fluttered open. He blinked against the soft light before his gaze focused on his parents' faces. "Mom? Dad?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse and the breathing tube that had only been removed hours earlier. They were at his side in an instant, tears of joy streaming down their faces. "We're here, son," Malcolm said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay."